Okay, I'm glad you could make it for this first episode of what I hope to be is a very long string of stories for you uh, to enjoy. So today I'm going to start with the book of Daniel, um, partly because unless you start with the first of Genesis in any stories from the Bible, then you pretty much have to have a story that has something that happened right before that. So, um, since I had a choice on this and we are kind of starting in the middle of something, then I wanted to use Daniel because there are a lot of good lessons in there, and we're just going to cover a little bit of one today. So, I'm going to switch to my reading glasses because I'm going to be going from the Bible on this one, and I don't always remember everything. So, it's good to have the information right there at your fingertips when you need to bring it up. So we are in Daniel chapter 1. Now, what had been happening up until this time with Daniel was that God's people, the Israelites, had their own nation. Well, this had started back uh, quite some time before that, but what we would call that today is a country. Now, there's a difference between a nation and a country. A nation's a group of people. They have some kind of common purpose or common um, relationship to each other. A country is more of a physical thing, like the United States is a country, and the Americans are the nation of the United States. So you can go with that when you start thinking about this. And so the Israelites had been a nation, even though they had lived in a number of different places. Uh, Probably the first time you really count them as being a nation is when they were in Egypt. Got out of that, made it to the land God had promised them, gave them the land. Of course, they had to do a little bit of work to get that land, but still, without his help, they wouldn't have gotten it at all. So they had their own nation, and it was a problem. God had a number of rules for them, and some of them were just plain good advice, and some of them were ones that were very specific to what he wanted. And most of the people chose not to follow those. Well, that led to all kinds of problems. Eventually, that country broke up into two parts, and the first part of the country, Israel, was taken off into captivity by the Assyrians. What was left was Judah, and they went along for some time after that, but then they had a problem following God's rules, and the Babylonians came along. Now, the Babylonians are sometimes called the Chaldeans, but essentially the same people. Their leader was an emperor named Nebuchadnezzar. Now, the difference between a king and an emperor is that a king controls maybe one country or even one city, a small area. An emperor covers a huge country and maybe other countries as well. And what the Babylonians would do is go in with their big army, take over another one. It would become part of their empire. Then they'd go to the next one, take it over, and they would fight some of the other big empires around there, like the Egyptians had one at that time. The Babylonians beat them pretty well. So the Israelites and their small country of Judah um, made a poor alliance, and you can call that for two reasons. One is they didn't look to God for help, so bad choice there. The other thing is that they decided to go with the Egyptians, who turned out not to be very helpful in fighting the Babylonians. Babylonians came in, took over, got rid of the king, grabbed a bunch of people, took them into captivity. They also killed a lot of the Israelites. They also burned down the temple, which was kind of a big deal because that was a special building dedicated to God. Um, and they had been warned that things like this were going to happen, but most of them just didn't follow the rules. So, what ended up happening is that several of the men, actually more like young boys, were taken off to Babylon because they had this idea in mind. They said, okay, what we'll do is when we take over one of these other countries, we are going to take some of their young men who seem kind of smart and can learn things and they're willing to go along with what we had to say. Because frankly, if the young men didn't want to go along with what they had to say, they'd probably kill them. So young men had a motivation for going along with it. Well, they picked out amongst the other people that they took was a fellow named Daniel. Then there was Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And you notice I look into my Bible for that because Daniel would kind of remember his name pretty easily. Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, a lot of us remember better as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And you go, okay, well, why aren't they called by this different name? Well, as a matter of fact, they were called by the different name. Daniel was called something like Belteshazzar, which is a way long name, and I'm glad we don't go with that one. Names meant something in those days. In fact, your name means something. You may not know what it is, but Daniel's name meant God is my judge. Okay, that makes sense. Hananiah's name, a gift of the Lord. Okay, Mishael is who is like God, and Azariah, he who knows the Lord. So you see, their names all had something to do with the God of Israel, the real God. The names that they were given all had something to do with one of the many gods that the Babylonians worshipped. So now you see kind of why they would change their names. Now, in this case, Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego were all put into a program. Now, they're supposed to be kind of smart to start with, and they also have a gift for learning as well. So the Babylonians had this program where they would take people every time they conquered them, take some of these fellows in, they'd give them 3 years to learn what they could for the Babylonians, meaning, of course, one thing you'd have to learn the language that the Babylonians used, but then they also taught them the stories. Now, stories are very important. In fact, like this story I'm telling you is an important story. And the Babylonians had stories that they thought were pretty important, and you needed to know in order to understand the Babylonians. That kind of makes sense. So they had that they would learn. Plus, they were also to grow in wisdom. And there's being smart, but there's also wisdom. Now, smart, you know a lot of things, or you have the ability to know a lot of things. Wisdom works a little bit differently. It's knowing how best to use what you do know. Turns out these guys were pretty sharp in the wisdom department, but they immediately ran into a problem. Now, one of these things that goes, well, they don't really tell you a whole lot, but you kind of figure it out from this, is that, okay, they were going to put, the Babylonians were going to put 3 years into teaching you these things. At the end of 3 years, you were going to go and meet the emperor, Nebuchadnezzar himself, and he would talk with you for a little while. Now, my hunch is that if you did not show yourself very well when you met the emperor, you might not still be alive for supper. So they needed to learn what they could, but they also needed to be able to impress the emperor that they would be good workers, because that's what they were going to be doing. They were going to be working for the country, doing what they could to do whatever the emperor wanted them to do. So they accepted that part of it, but there was one thing they would not accept. Now, part of the training program for 3 years is that you, if you were part of the program, would get to eat the food, drink the wine that the king provided. In fact, he's the one who picked out what you would eat and drink. Problem with that was the Jewish people, who another name for the Israelites, had certain rules God had given them. Things they could eat, things they could not eat. And most of the countries that were not part of Judaism, the Jewish people and all that, ate a lot of things that God said, don't want you eating that. Well, Daniel goes and asks the head guy who was in charge of all of the people who were being trained. He said, do we have to eat this? We'd rather not eat all this stuff. And this guy goes, hey, look, you might start looking sick if you don't eat this food, and then the king's going to kill me if that happens. So I don't think we'll be doing that. Well, Daniel didn't stop though. But you see, it was important for him to follow God's rules. So he went to the guy who's immediately in charge of him and said, but before I do that, I have to say, he had to think about this. No doubt he prayed, because what we find out about Daniel and his friends later on, they do a lot of praying, and they try their best to follow whatever it is God wants them to do. So when he goes to this fellow, he has an idea, and he says, tell you what, is it okay if we just eat vegetables and drink water? And that's all. And this fellow's going, I'm not so sure about that. And Daniel says, well, let's do this for 10 days. And in fact, I was going to look down in here, and he said, after 10 days, if we don't look healthy and all that, then we'll go and eat the food that we're supposed to eat. But if not, then we'd be okay if we just continue to do that. This guy thinks, okay, 10 days, not that long. All right, we'll do that. Well, turns out they did this. After 10 days, they looked healthier than the people who were eating the food that the king had provided. Now, a couple of things we can learn out of all of this. One is that it does matter what you eat and drink and how it affects you. And in this case, okay, your parents were right. Eating vegetables is good for you. It's not going to hurt you. Another thing in here is that their desire to follow God was more important than anything else. So in doing this, they passed through what they were supposed to pass through, learned what they were supposed to learn, but then the next step was, after the 3 years, they go up in front of the emperor, Nebuchadnezzar. He meets them, talks with them. Turns out these guys are sharp. He's going, these guys know more than my other advisors. So you see, the thing is, they were being groomed for a job. Not only would they be doing what the king wanted them to do, they would also be there to know things and be able to advise the king. Now, I said king, emperor, it's kind of the same thing in this case. So I hope this all makes sense to you. I really like it in this sense because we're getting the foundation of what Daniel does. And in the long run, you're going to see how some of the things that he learns early on are going to stay with him the rest of his life. And you'll find that this is not just one of those things where he asks God for help, and then when he gets by it, he forgets about God. No, he's consistent. He's always going to follow God. And it appears that he's not too concerned about what happens to him if he's punished for following God. And that's something that we'll talk about more. But this is enough for the first time, and we'll get that the next time we talk about Daniel. Now, I do want to say my tie does have something to do with the story today. If you look at it, you notice that it's candy corn. Now, if we were talking about real corn, that would be something that Daniel and Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego would be able to eat and be okay. Candy corn, maybe that's more like the other foods that were on the table that they didn't want to eat. So my idea is that, okay, little candy corn might be okay, but it's better to stick with the real stuff if you have a chance at it. All right, well, I hope you got something out of this, and I hope you'll get to see me again soon. Talk to you later.